The COVID-19 pandemic is a health crisis the likes of which has not been seen in decades, and certainly not within my lifetime. The global infection total now sits at over 2.5 million. By the time this video is actually up, I have no doubt that number will have crossed the threshold to over 3 million. In America alone, nearly 2,000 people per day die from the disease, and this rate has shown no sign of slowing. The responses from the governments of the world have ranged from pathetic at best to shockingly inhumane at worst. In Wuhan, where the virus was first reported, state officials attempted to cover up the outbreak and relentlessly punished those who spoke out about the truth. While it is Dr. Li Wenling's story that is most well known, he was far from alone in facing state persecution for his attempts to save human lives. Despite their claims to be fighting for a socialist future, the Chinese government, like all capitalist states, won't hesitate to throw the working class under the bus the moment they resist capital's destructive expansion and disregard for human well-being. Iran's government, too, has done much to downplay the severity of the disease's spread within its borders, putting millions at risk as it does so. Though they finally relented to international pressure and opened up about what has been obvious for so long now, they haven't abandoned their usual layers of justification for their deceit. While showing a disgusting lack of respect for human rights, the justifications provided by the Iranian regime are not without merit. Despite being called upon to do so by the United Nations, the United States has not lifted its sanctions on Iran. Under intense economic pressure, the Iranian government has been compelled to continue business as usual in order to maintain their increasingly fragile economy. Were the United States to lift sanctions, however, we've seen little reason to suspect that Iran's treatment of its people would change much. The well-being of the working class has never been a high priority for dictatorships. China and Iran, two nations so generally despised by the mainstream international community, are easy to pick on, but the United States itself has had as much of a role in this disaster as any other player on the field. In collaboration with the World Health Organization, the US government may bear the most responsibility for downplaying the severity of this crisis on an international scale. And unlike Iran, the United States has yet to fully admit to the now painfully obvious truth. President Trump speaks as if the disease is contained and under control, when it was only a month ago that he told the American people that it wasn't an issue at all. If the disease is so under control, why was it allowed to spread as far as it has been? Why is the easing of restrictions already being discussed when the disease has yet to be stamped out? The clear reason, of course, is capital. Profits can't be made while workers are social distancing. If bodies must accumulate for capital to do so as well, it's a price the capitalist governments of the world are more than happy to pay. It won't be Donald Trump or his family forced back onto the workshop floors after all. The last global pandemic, the Spanish flu of 1918, left over 50 million dead in its wake, eclipsing the casualty total of the First World War by a landslide. Far from being an unrelated natural disaster that happened to follow the war, the Spanish flu is thought to have been spread primarily by the wartime movement of troops and their eventual return home. The Spanish flu, rather paradoxically, was not discovered in Spain, but rather it was the Spanish media who was first to report on its discovery. During the First World War, the vast majority of governments involved in the conflict had passed censorship laws, preventing news media from spreading information that could be considered detrimental to the war effort. This naturally included news of an outbreak this deadly. Spain, as a neutral country, was one of the few exceptions to this, and thus shared information on the outbreak freely. The conditions of the spread of Spanish flu are largely historically specific, and we have the good fortune that COVID-19 did not break out during a period in history with similar conditions. These conditions provided easy excuses for the world's governments to explain their failure to organize a global response. Today, no world war rages, and we have a century's worth of medical and technological advancements at our disposal, and yet the clearly necessary global response has not yet been mobilized to combat what is now a global pandemic. Two masters command the world's governments. One master commands moral authority, and the other commands systemic authority. It is naturally systemic authority that proves the dominant master. No concern for human life, genuine or otherwise, can trump the basic fact that the success of a capitalist government is measured by the success of capitalism under it, and the success of capitalism is measured by the degree to which capital is accumulated. Though capitalism is a global system, it is still divided into national sectors. Even if capital operates globally, any specific poles of capital must ground themselves somewhere nationally, and it is the job of a representative nation-state to do what it can to support the growth of said capital. To do otherwise would lead to a mass exodus of capital and the collapse of the national economy. Capital now operates with such freedom on a global level that now more than ever, nation states must compete for poles of capital the way poles of capital must compete for customers. On March 27th, the Urtzania Spanish police forces local to the Basque region intervened in emerging workers' protests at the major steel firm Sidnor. These workers took to the streets in defiance of Spain's state confinement orders to protest Sidnor's insistence on a return to work for non-essential laborers into unsafe conditions. It is argued by the workers that this is in fact a violation of Spanish health and safety code. The state confinement order gives a veneer of justification to the Spanish police's actions, but one is forced to wonder why the Spanish forces were so concerned with the breaking up of the labor strikes and so uninterested in the reasons for those strikes. Of course, in light of what we've already discussed, this mystery appears less of a mystery and more of an exemplar. Rather than an oddity, it's mundane. It calls to mind the famous Pullman strike incident, in which American troops were called in to suppress railroad strikers, resulting in the slaughter of dozens. And more recently, perhaps, it should remind us of the Dakota Pipeline, where police hosed protesters with high-pressure water in freezing weather, despite the protests being both perfectly legal and peaceful. When Marx called the capitalist state a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, this is what he had in mind. When Lenin described capitalist democracy as democracy for the rich, this is what he meant. It's not a matter of politicians being corrupted by private interest groups or lobbying groups intervening in policymaking, although this does play a role. Rather, since the basic function of the capitalist state is to uphold capitalism as such, it must intervene in economic affairs regularly on behalf of capital's interests, while going against those of the working class. The capitalist state cannot support the long-term interests of the working class, and this is the fatal flaw in social democratic attempts to make capitalism nicer. A government presiding over a society based on capital production that does not prioritize the production of capital is a state that fights against the very foundations of itself while remaining firmly rooted within them. It is a vain and hopeless struggle against the systemic power of capitalism, a struggle that all who have fought it have inevitably lost. Of course, I'm hardly alone in coming to these general conclusions. As the world's governments scramble to insulate capital from the crisis, leftists from around the world have organized as well in the name of preserving and protecting human life. A cross-current point of commonality has been the advocacy of mutual aid networks, local, community-driven organizations designed to meet the needs of the community with the power of the community itself. Lest I be misunderstood, I should make clear here and now. I think mutual aid networks are a remarkably important tool in the arsenal of the working class. In times such as these, action must be taken, and the state has shown time and time again that it will not do these actions. Any and all activity wherein the working class takes matters into its own hands and stops placing its faith in the capitalist political machine is an activity that I can and will get behind with all of my being. The problem I have with leftists advocating for mutual aid networks has nothing to do with these networks themselves being problematic, but rather that the left, as it has seemingly historically always found itself, is falling behind the class struggle at large. Where both workers and leftists are taking part in the organizing of mutual aid groups, it is the working class itself that has embraced all facets of the class struggle. For an example particularly close to my heart, if not my home, drivers from Lyft and Uber in California went on protest back in mid-March. Both companies are legally required to classify their drivers as proper employees, yet both still treat them as independent contractors. As such, these drivers are denied paid sick leave, minimum wage income, and other such things that are crucial to their very survival in a global pandemic. Towards the end of the month, the strikers turned their attention towards the government as well, calling them out for their failure to enforce the laws they themselves had passed. The Rideshare Drivers United Union called upon its members to file claims online with the California Labor Commission starting on March 30th, demanding the government help compensate them for the wages they are entitled to and are denied. Perhaps a more prominent example would be the wave of Amazon warehouse strikes, the total number of which now stretches into the dozens. These strikes have been triggered, of course, by COVID-19 and Amazon's refusal to address employees' reasonable safety concerns, but it can hardly be said that it is all these strikes are about. Laborers at Amazon have long had issues with how they are treated by the company, issues that Amazon has done next to nothing to address. If COVID-19 was the spark, it is these long simmering issues that provided the kindling. Another example would be the previously discussed strikers in Spain. Within that episode of the class struggle, we found an example of the capitalist nation-state's contempt for the working class. But looking at that episode now within the context of the global actions by international workers, we can also see an example of the continued bravery, perseverance, and tenacity of the working class in the face of that contempt. With the class struggle laid bare in today's global crisis, it seems that there'd be no better time for leftist politics to shine than right now. After all, leftists base their worldview around the class struggle and fight to see it through to its logical conclusion, the end of the capitalist mode of production. And yet we don't see this. In fact, we see quite the opposite. As the working class gears up and organizes itself to engage in fully fledged class warfare, it is those on the left who can't seem to muster the confidence to have faith in such class action. This is not an isolated phenomenon. It is completely consistent with the history of the socialist left. As workers took to the streets of Germany to protest the First World War, every member of the German Social Democratic Party, except one, voted in favor of authorizing war credits. Rosa Luxemburg said of it that it was a devastating political and moral defeat, an outrageous debacle and rot without parallel. I'm inclined to agree. Such failures are not anomalies, and when they are repeated with such consistency and regularity, our critiques must turn inward. What is it in socialist theory, as it's understood by most socialist theorists, that leads to such a situation? Why is it that the left finds itself constantly advocating for the working class to take up class struggle, but never finds itself ready for class struggle when the time comes? Those seeking to answer these questions today don't do so in isolation. These questions aren't particularly new. Figures such as Luxemburg and Vladimir Lenin grappled with these questions over 100 years ago, largely in response to the previously mentioned German Social Democratic approval of war credits. While the experience and thoughts of those in the past can never speak for the present, they can certainly speak to it, and help us work through the specific issues and crises that we face today. While Lenin and Luxemburg were both explicit and vocal about their break with Kautsky in 1914, and rightly outraged by the actions taken by the German Social Democrats under his leadership, both had issues with Kautsky's Marxism that had been simmering for years. Luxemburg had actually broken openly with Kautsky as early as 1910, with her set of articles today collectively known as Theory and Practice. She simply had withheld open hostility until 4 years later. At the core of Luxemburg's dispute with Kautsky is the matter of what she called the mass strike. First explored in her 1906 analysis of the 1905 revolution in Russia, the mass strike was Luxemburg's attempt to give a theoretical voice to the spontaneous and creative energy of the working class in revolution. Where class struggle appeared in the writings of Kautsky as the abstract notion of competing class interests in capitalist society, Luxemburg transformed it into a concrete understanding of how the working class operated in practice. Instead of seeing such spontaneity as a threat to the assumed leadership of the brilliant Marxist Party, Luxemburg saw it as something that Marxists ought to appreciate and grapple with seriously. In her own words,
"The revolution, even when the proletariat with the Social Democrats at their head appear in the leading role, is not a maneuver of the proletariat in the open field, but a fight in the midst of the incessant crashing, displacing, and crumbling of the social foundation."
Karl Kautsky, as have most Marxists historically, saw himself as such a schoolmaster, only willing to engage with the working class once they'd signed themselves up for a special brand of tutelage. When the working class showed that it had no intention of doing so, Kautsky had no option but to retract in horror. His theoretical viewpoint simply did not allow for anything else. Lenin, more famously, had much to say about Kautsky's elitist attitude towards the proletariat. He lambasted the German Social Democrats for their willingness to integrate themselves to the capitalist political machine. As Lenin pointed out, the deficiencies of Kautsky in theory weren't simply personal failings, but were facilitated by the German Social Democrats' very method of organization. Kautsky, at one point, was at least a partial representative of the left, but as his own power grew, his rightward shift solidified. By the time 1909 rolled around, Kautsky was firmly opposed to the left wing of his own party. In his words, socialism could only come about through the, quote, slow accumulation of forces, which to him meant the growing power of state and union bureaucracy that professed itself dedicated to socialist aims. For professional parliamentarian socialists, the power of the working class can mean nothing other than the power of themselves, the supposed representatives of the working class. In the name of expanding working class power, the so-called socialist representatives increasingly set aside the interest of the working class themselves in favor of the interest of their own careers, since preserving their position in government is the same as preserving working class power in their eyes. The fundamental issue here is a separation between the real, concrete working class as it actually exists, a separation that manifests both philosophically and organizationally. This gap cannot be closed by a change in rhetoric or simply by listening more, but only through a serious investigation into what forms of organization are appropriate for the class struggle today. And this is a question that can only be worked out in active dialogue with the working class in revolt, not a dialogue done amongst socialists on its behalf. More and more, we see groups such as the DSA severing the ties they once had to genuine working class struggles. The more power the DSA accumulates, the more shallow their self-professed socialism becomes, something reflected in their recent efforts to paper over the genuinely radical legacy left behind by their founding members such as Michael Harrington. Such is the fate of all organizations who attempt to wed themselves to the capitalist political machine, rather than heeding Marx's advice to smash it. Similarly, once promising, at least in a certain sense, social democrats within the Democratic Party, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who emerged largely out of the struggle against ICE and Donald Trump, have embraced a right shift in recent months. Even more so than the DSA, whatever minor radical ambitions AOC might have once had have now been completely subsumed by the banality demanded by capitalist politics. The lesson that we should learn from this isn't simply that working within the capitalist state machine is a dead end, although that's certainly an important lesson to learn. If we transfer the broken organizational methods from reformism to a revolutionary rather than parliamentarian context, we've still failed to address the problem that sits at the base of this whole issue. The working class, as it takes an active role in the class struggle, becomes aware of itself as a class. It becomes aware of its common interests and the collective power it can muster once it comes together as a class. This is not an automatic process, but rather one in which socialists and communists can play an active part. Our job is not, however, to attempt to take control of this process as an outside presence, be it for reformist or revolutionary aims. The working class should not be subsumed by a power outside itself. The job of Marxists is not to appear to them as prophets handing down the masses an eternal truth. Rather is to take the theory and the history that we have reflected upon for years and work out how to make these lessons we have learned from them concrete for the class struggle as it actually exists today. In this process, the creative spontaneity of the masses must play a crucial role. Revolution cannot occur without a philosophy of revolution, but such a philosophy cannot take on a concrete form unless it is developed in accordance with the spontaneous outburst of the masses in struggle. It is only through an active dialogue with the struggling working class that theory ceases to be the abstract hobby of revolutionists and instead becomes a relevant social force in its own right. This isn't to suggest that Marxists should not organize amongst themselves, but rather that we must work out methods of organization that do not separate Marxist organizations from the struggling masses the way that vanguardist organizational methods have historically done. There's no textbook answer for what such organizational forms would look like. It's an issue that must be answered anew as the class struggle itself takes on new forms.
To a revolutionary theoretician, what is important is that the new stage of economic development is always considered in strict relationship to the subjective development of workers' revolt. And flowing from this relationship comes the working out of a new relationship between theory and practice in a way that the philosophy of revolution and its forces do not get separated.
COVID-19 presents us with new and difficult challenges. Organizing class struggle during a pandemic is no easy feat, and it's not something for which there is great historic precedence. As the working class experiments with new forms of organization and struggle, Marxists must take up the task of critically engaging with them. This means doing more than regurgitating standard talking points and tired Trotskyist pleas to build the party. Moreover, the responses of the working class, as inspirational and promising as they've been, are not uniformly progressive. COVID-19 has brought long-simmering xenophobia to the surface, with xenophobic rhetoric a part of normalized discussion and anti-Asian hate crimes on the rise. This doesn't give us cause to distance ourselves from these movements, but rather, they make our involvement with them all the more crucial. Movements that lack a concrete philosophy and worldview open themselves up to taking such intellectual shortcuts, relying on prejudice rather than theoretical coherence. The ruling order has no recourse to COVID that does not devastate the working class, and no ideological justification that does not insult our intelligence. No development in how capital organizes itself changes the fundamental class dynamics inherent to it. The working class cannot rely on social democratic politicians to look out for it, and Marxists can't afford to allow capital the time necessary to recuperate the emerging struggles against it. Resistance to recuperation requires far more than sloganeering, but a thoroughgoing philosophy of revolution made concrete for our own struggles today. This video would quite literally not have been possible for me to make were it not for the help offered by Red Plateaus. I do not have access to a computer strong enough to edit video, and so they offered to take care of this part of the video making process for me. It literally would not have been possible without their help. They make fantastic content. I will put a link to their channel in the description, and you should check them out. I'd also like to thank Cuck Philosophy as well as Jack Graham, both of whom recorded quotes for this video. They too have their own projects, links to which will be in the description.